Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back to the Grid Mod Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Cook, and today's conversation cuts right maybe to the center where utilities, regulators, and hopefully communities find themselves wondering, living in the era of extreme weather is truly no longer an exception. And so there is this desire to wonder around what is the reliability of our utilities and how they serve our power. It's no longer just a grid performance metric. It's becoming a part of our conversations. And so our guest today is Michael Levy. He's a partner and a part of the U.S. Utilities lead at Baringa. And I'll let him introduce himself. And we're going to be talking about a report that I think is really exciting and stems from a few conversations that we had where we're looking at storm data and how do we shift what we measure and how we hold each other accountable to having a resilient grid. So, Michael, with that, welcome. I look forward to this discussion. Let our listeners know who you are and we'll jump in.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me on the Grid Mod Pod, Dr. Cook. Been a long time listener, so definitely an honor to finally be serving as a guest. Just a bit about me. I live in Atlanta and been doing utilities consulting for about 16 years and worked at a number of different consulting firms. Been at Baringa for the last 2.5. And Baringa is a 2,000 person global management advisory business that's cross industry, though our deepest industry spike is within energy. And as you had noted, I run the utilities business for the U.S. So we work with investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities and co-ops, as well as do a lot of work with the Department of Energy. And a lot of our work orients around asset investment planning and optimizing the investments that they make in the grid to keep the lights on. So in the advisement that we've done with lots of different utilities, we've noticed that there's been a big gap in the industry, both in the measurement of resilience, and we'll define that here in a moment, but also how utilities are using resilience in the way that they do investment planning. And there's about a dozen states that have performance incentives tied to reliability, but very notably, none of them include major event days. And customers really don't care when the lights are off if it was because of a major event like a storm or a polar vortex or an atmospheric river like they have in California, all these different hazards. They just want their power back. And so because their major events are excluded, there really is no formal mechanism today to hold utilities accountable for achieving resilience in the face of extreme weather. And so we recently published this paper with the Smart Electric Power Alliance on a dual metric framework for how to measure resilience, and really excited to share what we hope will become an industry standard on how to address that gap.
Right. And just for some of our listeners, if you didn't listen to the past few episodes, there is this, I guess, framing the problem. There's a lot of conversation around reliability versus resilience. And for decades, reliability, as you're saying, the metrics have been formulated, adopted, accepted, and are a significant part of our regulatory avenues to how utilities are incentivized based on their clear performance of said metrics. And I always think it's interesting because most folk that sit outside a large organization or a system of systems don't understand, kind of the tactical drivers that any entity really moves through. So reliability metrics is a way for utilities to quantify how often and for how long customers are without power. And so IEEE helped formulate this, probably 80s and 90s. We can fact check that. But it's really the SAIDI, CAIDI, and SAIFI are kind of the predominant ones. And there's been a lot of discussion in this space around even getting more granular with the new recent available AMI data. So I'm just kind of clarifying and setting you up. That has been an industry's North Star, is to ensure that the metrics are within a certain level to then be able to be stacked against their peers to determine overall performance. And like you said, we as individual consumers don't really differentiate an outage due to a very large event or versus an outage due to an uncontrollable event of a car hitting a telephone pole and taking out your power for certain minutes. So those metrics fall in this moments that most people don't understand. Anyway, so what you have been able to share is kind of a new perspective of how can, well, I guess I'll give you, let's build it up for our audience. So we have these reliability metrics, and some may
Why
say,
does it matter,
yeah,
right?
some could say they're misleading or, maybe not transparent, right? So from your perspective and you alluded to it in your introduction, what is that approach that you kind of been researching?
Sure. So reliability is generally going to be defined as driven by age and condition driven outages or customer interruptions. And the reason why major events, which has a specific IEEE definition, but you can think of them generally as like big storms, wildfires, hurricanes, polar vortexes, derechos, like these are things that where you've got a substantial number of customers out for an extended period of time. Those are classified as major events. And the reliability metrics that you had noted, Safety, Sadie, and Katie, they utilities exclude major events for a couple of reasons. One is when they benchmark reliability against each other, they want to do it in a normalized way and perhaps fairly, say, well, we should be excluding extreme events that are driven by the weather for which we have no control. Similarly, when utility commissions are measuring reliability, they also exclude major events for the same reasons. The utility says we can't control the weather, and therefore we shouldn't be accountable for what happens in any given year. And so there's this challenge of how do you hold utilities accountable for achieving resilience, which in this case is resistance to those types of extreme weather, those major event days, and also the effectiveness of their restoration efforts to recovery when they do occur, but not unfairly penalizing them for the volatility that is associated with interannual extreme weather. And so what we did is we went back to the drawing board and said, okay, let's define a metric that builds on existing methodologies that helps solve this exact challenge. And the metric that we came up with is called MySafety, which is just multi-year SAFE. And SAFE is the System Average Interruption Frequency Index, which is basically just how many outages does each customer experience on average per year. So it's total outages divided by total customers. And so an outage of one, or a SAFE of one would mean if I have 100 customers, the expectation is each customer experiences on average one outage of greater than 5 minutes per year. If you're doing a multi-year average, then that would just be averaging that same value, but over a multi-year period. And so the question that we asked ourselves was, well, if we wanted to smooth the volatility from extreme weather, what would be a sufficient duration that for that multi-year average, inclusive of the extreme weather, such that the utility is not being unfairly penalized? And so we did the math and looked at the standard deviation of with med versus without med. And as it turns out, a 5-year average is sufficiently long for 75% of utilities across the US using the IEEE standard, and 7 years is virtually all of them. And so what that means is
magic number 7.
yep. So what that means in practice is for a utility, if I take a 7-year average of their SAFE, the customer interruptions, average interruptions per customer, and I include it with all major event days, that is a sufficiently long duration so that the volatility from extreme weather based on the last 10 years of historic weather data is smoothed away. And the reason why we think this metric has a good chance of broad adoption is for a couple of reasons. One is it builds on a metric that both commissions and utilities already measure and already are familiar with. And two, perhaps more importantly, it's over a duration that gives the utility a long enough time to actually outperform. When utilities make investments in resilience, so this could be things like flood mitigation for substations, undergrounding of assets, hardening of poles by upgrading them to a stronger class or a stronger material, there's no guarantee that where they make an investment, that year or even the subsequent year, a storm hits and can allow the value of that resilience investment to be materialized. And so it takes time for there to be a coincidence of bad weather and hardening investments for that to actually accrue benefits. Not to mention the fact that it takes time for the utilities to actually do the hardening themselves. And so by allowing the utility in enough time to actually outperform against a target, it aligns their incentives while still making them accountable for those outcomes.
So, to break it down for the newbies of the utility world, which we are finding, if you talk about electric utilities nowadays or energy, it is becoming a hyped topic. Who would have thunk? But you just a reminder, so a big part of this reliability versus resiliency conversation, stemmed from the realization that large storms were becoming a reality, like we said at the beginning. And so, it's really this, as you stated, like an accountability in the air of extreme weather. So taking a pulse of like understanding what was, where we are today, and then projecting where we ought to be. So the work that you're talking about is, in the roots of it, knowing how challenging it is to gain adoption of anything new in a very complex entity such as the electric utility space is difficult. But what you kind of leaned in on is, and I'm just kind of repeating, is like utilities should be held accountable for performance, especially during chaos. Maybe like not during the calm or the blue day. What is it called? The blue sky days.
Yep.
But then one could argue that that's unfair because utilities can't control weather. So, and I will say there's been a lot of dialogue within our utility members of like the definition of reliability, if done well and correctly, like you leaned in on asset health or asset performance, but there is a significant amount of outages that occur from like number one is trees, not like even if it isn't a storm day, then it's like little critters and then, vehicle accidents because most outages are due to a distribution type event. It doesn't say transmission large events occur, but so there is this like if we do our reliability right, it would help us be resilient. But then I guess the countermeasure is well, resiliency is about how to respond after said event occurs, right? And what you're saying is this new metric, you've able to prove that with this scaling 7-year, multi-year, you're taking out that
The
volatility to then give back to the utilities a performance metric that they could then normalize across their peers, which is in effect, a very empowering, move because as you stated, the metrics that currently are being measured are a part of your method, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I guess I,
So
it, it,
my question is the industry ready for this new benchmark and what does that look like?
yeah, I sure hope so. But frankly, I don't know that we have a choice. I mean, whether the industry is ready for a way to measure and hold utilities accountable for resilience is irrelevant to the increasing frequency, severity, and diversity of extreme weather events that customers are facing today. Our view is if you can measure it, you can manage it. And coming back to your definition of resilience, the NARUC agreed upon definition is withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from major power disruptions.
Tell our
And so,
listeners who is NARUC.
yeah, thanks. The National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissions. I mean, that's like a generally accepted definition of resilience. But that I think you bring up a good point, which is that withstand piece is kind of what we're talking about. We deliberately define our resilience framework in a dual metric framework. So you have a resistance element which is your ability to resist outages. That's measured by MySafety. But there's also a recover piece of this. I don't think it's realistic to assume that utilities can build their assets in a way that they can withstand all types of events. That would be cost prohibitive. And so there is a level of resistance that customers will accept. That then means that when outages do occur, there's an expectation that the utility is effective at their restoration efforts. And so our resistance metric is MySafety, but then you have this complementary recovery metric called MERT, M-E-R-T, which is major event restoration time. And a lot of utilities are tracking this already today, but an example of that would be something like, how long does it take for me to get 95% of my customers back on when an event does occur? The reason why a metric like that is important is because if you look at a similar metric, say like CAIDI, which is customer average interruption duration index, which is effectively the average outage duration, that value can be dramatically inflated when you've got a couple of customers with really long duration outages. So let's say I've got like Florida Power and Light, where they're hit by a hurricane and they had millions of customers out, but in less than 2 days, they get 90% of them back online. Objectively, that is an outstanding performance and they should be rewarded accordingly. Whereas a CAIDI metric might not appropriately reflect that. And so looking at both the resistance and the recovery side are really key. And that's what we propose in the framework.
And so you brought up cost. So a big part of the requirement, really the need to unify one's, when we say one's, the utilities response to preparing the grid for these events to be resilient is, without a metric or a way to compare performance or baseline performance to then measure said new performance, is tied to cost, right? So, how can we, as a society that supports the electric utility grid, as we know it, wrong, right, or indifferent, there's three parties involved, right? There's the those that will execute the work, the regulators that will assume or enable or provide oversight and funds through rate making process to fund said resiliency project, and then the customer expectation of what those resiliency is. AKA, how do you tie a value or a dollar value to a resiliency type project? And so kind of where the industry has been over the last 15, 20 years is everyone within their own space have been actively working towards qualifying, quantifying the cost of resiliency. But what this work does, if it was like accepted and understood by, say, an organization as NARUC, it gives a pathway that the entities that are already doing something unify across two new metrics that more or less what you're saying is the resiliency metric is something equals, what is it at
Resilience equals resistance plus recovery.
which is your MERT,
ICP and MERT.
MySafety and MERT, which is very simple.
Yes,
right.
That's the idea. Is we wanted it to keep it extremely simple so that regulators and commissions could understand it, and then utilities can explain it to their investors if they're held accountable to achieve those outcomes. On the cost piece, I'm glad. I think you laid it out really, really well, which is you've got three stakeholders. You've got the regulator, the customer, and the utility. And the way that we think about how those are interrelated and the linkage between them is this concept of measure, monetize, manage. And so the regulator, the way that they're accountable to the customer is they measure MySafety and MERT. That's how they're measuring the outcomes that are achieved. The way that the utility is accountable to the customer is the customer, through value of lost load, is telling them, that's the monetize piece, this is how much avoiding an outage of a particular duration is worth to me. And I'll give a shout out to my friends at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs for their recent refresh on the ICE calculator and the work that they're doing with POET. And so this idea of monetizing resilience allows the utility to then say, well, if we make investments, we can actually calculate the NPV of those investments. And that's the manage piece linkage back to the regulator. And so the customer is saying, this is what resilience is worth to me. And then the utility is saying, okay, well, these are the investments, how much they cost. How do I, in a extreme weather adjusted way, prioritize a portfolio of adaptations using benefit cost analysis? That's a lot of work that we do with investor and utilities. And then the commission can say, okay, well, we're going to give you the money, but we need to have a way to keep you accountable for the outcomes that you've proposed based on those investments. And that's that measure piece. So you can kind of see the linkage across the three.
We're doing real good with our alliterations. Measure, monetize,
That's by
manage.
design.
Okay. And then what was it? Resistance
Measure,
plus,
monetize, manage.
and
Yep.
then resistance plus recovery equals resilience.
Resilience equals
Yeah.
resistance recovery. Yeah, a lot of formulas there.
And I think another, just to kind of share, looping in what you said, like customers in general. I remember when I came into the utility, I worked for utilities, then I came into utility. And, when I came in about a decade ago, the expectation of the customer of when they would like their lights back on, like, was a tenfold increase from like the segmentation, like work that we were doing internally. Right. So
Hmm.
like, for instance, if a customer's lights were off for an hour, then they were calling. But then it came to the point where, like, if the customer's lights were off for 6 minutes, then they were calling. So just this like expectation, along with extreme weather, it's like there is, as you earlier said, an ever-present time to have a metric developed at this point in time so that we can drive some of these discussions more rapidly. And like one would say, do we have to have metrics to initiate, prioritize, or deem said projects, timeline? The answer is like, no, like there has to be trust that the utilities are effectively doing the work that is being prioritized by the data and the information that they currently have to operate a system that has been developed over a century. So like, I think we lose sight on the fact that like providing data and information that can be interpreted, analyzed, and then compared, and then tie a value to it is how to incentivize and prioritize this enormous amount of work of infrastructure rebuild that we have in our hands, right? And when
And make sure that the utilities are accountable for actually achieving the outcomes once that, I mean, you look at in Texas, that they just filed 3 different plans. You got AP Texas, Encore, Centerpoint. These guys are getting billions of dollars, rightfully so, to invest in resilience. But how do you measure to make sure that the benefits of that are actually being realized?
right.
And that's a key point that we make in the paper, is this concept of counterfactual analysis ex post, which is to say, if you are able to predict how an asset is going to behave under stress conditions from extreme weather, you can use the same models to test a counterfactual to actually monetize avoided cost. So for example, if I have a storm that comes through and I've got some assets that were hardened, then I can say, well, using the models that we've proposed where you're able to predict how assets behave under stress conditions, what would have happened had I not made an investment? How many outages do I avoid? And by the way, utilities are very familiar with this with distribution automation. They've been doing counterfactuals on that for a long time. The concept is the same here.
Buckets
Yeah,
have been doing it.
yeah,
Not
pockets,
all
yeah.
have been doing.
Perhaps more so for energy efficiency, right? That's like where you're baselining and doing matching control groups and so forth. Regardless, the utility can say, okay, we avoided this many benefits. Now, there might be other parts of our network where we did hardening that were not hit by a storm. That doesn't mean that those investments are worthless. It just means that the storm hasn't hit that area yet. So the utility, in the period between when they've been baselined and when they're meant to achieve their my safety target, they can use this ex post counterfactual analysis to see, well, are my investments paying off? Am I trending ahead or behind what I think is going to happen? That's really key, because you want to make sure that they have the ability to shift strategies in that period to more appropriately monetize the benefits. And one other point I wanted to make, Elizabeth, that you were alluding to earlier, which is cost effectiveness. So if you think about like when I make a resilience investment as a utility, I'm calculating the NPV of these different types of resilience investments. That if it's NPV positive, theoretically, that means it's prudent, right?
You just used an acronym
However,
and didn't define it.
yeah. However,
No, what was that? You used an acronym and didn't define it. You said
sorry.
NPV?
Oh, net present value. Yeah. Or the ratio of benefits to cost
Right.
discounted back. However, it might be that most of the time utilities, they're not going to be short of projects that are NPV positive. The thing that's going to be the binding constraint on where they make investments is just customer affordability. You know, there's a theoretical limit on how much rates can increase each year that people say it doesn't matter. Like enough is enough. I'm not willing to let it outpace any inflation anymore. And so what we find for most utilities is that customer affordability tends to be the binding constraint, less so cost effectiveness. There's plenty of investments the utility can make. And so knowing that you're going to have plenty of work to fill the portfolio and perhaps can't do it all, then doing this type of benefit cost analysis further reinforces the need, because then you want to make sure that you're optimizing the best, most cost-effective investments to buy down risk. And the way that you hold utilities accountable for achieving those outcomes, again, comes back to this framework.
Right. And I guess, another key aspect is when we hold accountable, we need to hold all of ourselves accountable. And I think ever more pressing, especially in these very transformational times, not only with the utilities are now beginning, like you stated that they've been in distribution automation for, pockets started in the early 90s, very small few had distribution SCADA. It wasn't until the 2000s before it started evolving. And then 2010, where utilities became really the tools and the data became actively available to create the models, to then set up the systems, to then run out and roll out automation. So this is an ever evolving space in general. To be able to transparently extract the data to provide these metrics that they are all being performed on. So if you think about like an exponential knee curve, now they have the data, they have the system models, they have the historical metrics based on reliability. And so that's ever rampant. And so when we think about what has governed or held them accountable and provide them the rules for which they can spend the capital and O&M, it's kind of within a box that was created for a time that what was. And so this is ever more saying that this is the time to evolve to a new set of metrics with a new perspective. And I think you're, hitting right at that. And I guess just to reiterate, us customers are now, we expect outages to be rare, right? Like what, 98.8, like isn't it like 98% reliability holistically of the grid here in the States, which is an enormous, which means you're not losing power very often, right? The expectations, as we said, restore within 1 to 4 hours is like a must. Maybe a significant storm within 2 days is like where our limit, and anything more, it becomes headline news. And I guess I just want to iterate, this metric and framework is timely because the data and the accessibility of said data is also becoming available. Like one could say it wasn't maybe easily extractable internally at a utility, right? There's this assumption that they have a lot more information than maybe they haven't, but that now they do. And so with that became customers, show us your work, right? So now we invited all the cooks into the kitchen, no pun intended, because I'm a cook, and said, like, how are your decisions made? What is your restoration sequence? Like, how are you prioritizing your investments? And I think, that's been the discussion, right, for about 30 years, is like that dance with those three stakeholders.
You bring up a really good point. I think so if you look at it from a macro perspective, the primary driver of system performance, reliability and like the customer's experience of service quality is the distribution network. And coincidentally, it also is the fastest growing area of investment by far, and therefore the primary driver of bill increases across the country. And so if you think about more and more things are being electrified, which means we're more dependent and our expectations for service quality are higher. And 1 in 6 Americans are now having trouble affording their bills. And so you've got these counteracting pressures without a formal way to measure what the target outcome is. And so that's really what this framework is aiming to address. And only recently have we seen, with extreme weather events serving as a catalyst, say like Sandy resulting in the requirement of resilience plans in New York, Beryl resulting in system resilience plans in Texas, the 8 named storms that happened in the early 2000s in Florida. We're only now recently seeing the need for commissions to say, hey, look, we can't keep giving you all this money to distribution rate cases that are just notoriously opaque. We have to see what's sitting behind this to make sure that the investments are being made prudently. But the piece that's been missing from all of that is actually holding the utilities accountable for achieving the outcomes associated with all that investment. And so it's, it requires both. You need the benefit cost analysis to justify the spend, but then you need to hold them accountable through these metrics to make sure that you're actually getting what you invested for.
Right. I think that this is kind of the chicken and the egg, right? Like there is a space where the trust has been dissolved to the point of the accountability and the governance has become extreme, which then drives the innovation and the scalability to be slow, which then creates more distrust, right? Like, so we're kind of in this like cycle because, on top of entities, they want to make sure everything is occurring in a way that will provide the reliability and the resiliency, but also in a very equitable way, right? So like ensuring all neighborhoods experience, similar outages than others. And I guess, the expectation that customers want to hear from the utilities, like silence is no longer acceptable, full attention must be occurred like as the event is happening. So how do you create those systems to communicate? And full circle, for utilities to be that responsive, to measure, to understand where their money needs to go, to then manage that, right? You need infrastructure from an IT data perspective to drive any of these insights to be able to qualify, quantify, and then communicate out. So, right. And at what point in time in that like cycle can we gain access and enough trust to deploy that type of funds to really then be able to expedite everything that we've been talking about? Which brings me back to data is kind of at the crux of us being able to drive such a framework as resilience, but we need to have the resilience metric defined. So we're like ahead of the game. So now we have to empower the use of it.
I tend to largely agree with that, though I think certain commissions, like on the back of that distrust, they swing the pendulum too far the other way. So for example, if you're a commission and you're requiring the utility to submit a detailed investment plan, and then you're holding them accountable for the variances at the project level, that's probably not appropriate or necessary. It's just creating unnecessary administrative burden for the regulator. It's creating unnecessary administrative burden for the utility. What really should be done is the commission sets an outcome and says, this is what I want you to achieve. And then it's the utilities' job to do what they can to achieve that outcome. And I think that this framework is intended to kind of elevate that, to alleviate the burden on both sides, while also being deliberately long enough so that the utility can actually outperform against it.
I think a lot of what needs to happen next during this transformational time is putting pen to paper and creating a framework, creating a metric, and then ensuring that the story that we tell is on a level that is understood by the stakeholders that we've been talking about, right? And that in itself is a talent. But having something created for the industry to observe, then adopt, and then scale is of utmost importance, because this whole conversation around we must build this resilient grid doesn't have strong roots until it has a metric. So that's why I was excited to have you on here to share, the work that you guys have been up to. And also I love that you gave a shout out to the ICE calculator, because I was using that in the early days and it definitely has improved. So, thinking about, adoption, we have, as a society, we have to realize that like there has been progress and there has been technology and there has been capabilities and like there has been lessons learned. So like just, we're paving that way. Maybe not as fast as we all want it to be. So with our last, wrapping up this conversation, what's your takeaway or shout out for anybody that's listening anew or maybe, thinks resilience is something they want to focus on? What are a shout out or maybe a call out for the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, the shameless plug is go and download the white paper. It's short. It's only like a dozen pages. If you just search SEPA Beyond the Baseline is the title, or SEPA Measuring Resilience. It was published on this last Friday, and we're gonna have a lot more events promoting this framework. We were deliberately not too prescriptive to say, here's exactly how you should be baselining and setting targets and doing reward and penalty schemes, though that is our hope eventually. We just want to start with the first step, which is let's coalesce the industry around a simple way to measure the outcome we're trying to achieve. And then we can talk about how to achieve it most cost effectively.
That's how it all starts.
That's right.
Well, thank you, Michael. And I look forward to seeing where this goes and maybe have you back on when we start seeing the adoption of our new metric.
Great. Thanks for having me, Dr. Cook.
Yep.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.